You're listening to the second episode of the Somali Spirit podcast. My name is Arawelo, and I'll be your guide on this journey to uncover intriguing aspects of Somali tradition, history, and culture. In the second episode, we're diving into the fascinating world of the Somali calendar, a sophisticated system of timekeeping that has guided Somali life for centuries. This episode was inspired by the foundational work Stars, Seasons, and Weather in Somali Pastoral Traditions, written in 1970 by Musa Haji Ismail Galal, a renowned Somali writer, scholar, linguist, historian, and polymath. Galal played a pivotal role in developing the Somali Latin alphabet and creating the Galal script, which was a standardized form of the Somali Arabic script. His book remains one of the most complete written records of the Somali calendar, capturing both lunar and solar systems, seasonal cycles, and the deep connection between Somali pastoral life and celestial patterns. Finding a copy of that book was no small feat, but in this episode, I aim to shine a light on Galal's insights and the spirit of Somali tradition. I've also added my own interpretations to make the knowledge of yesterday current, relevant, and accessible for today's listeners. In Somali culture, وقت قماها ساعة كلية. Time is not just the ticking of a clock. It is Nalasha, life, Ruhda, spirit, and Hususta, ancestral memory. And unlike the modern Gregorian calendar, the Somali calendar was not a product of bureaucrats, priests, or colonial empires. It was born of the land, the stars, and the lived experience of pastoralists who needed to know with precision when rains would fall, when herds must move, and when the earth would give life again. If we compare, the Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, is just over 400 years old. It was designed mainly to keep Christian feasts aligned with the solar year. The ancient Egyptian calendar, among humanity's oldest, counted 365 days tied to the flooding of the Nile and was already in use 4,000 years ago. The Somali calendar, though less written about, has roots just as ancient. Oral traditions, pastoral records, and astronomical cycles suggest that Somali timekeeping is one of the oldest calendrical systems still in use today, a hybrid of lunar and solar reckoning refined over millennia. And what makes it unique is its accuracy and adaptability. While the Gregorian calendar forces time into rigid units, the Somali system adjusted itself to reality. Months could be 29 or 30 days, depending on the actual sighting of the moon. And if the solar cycle drifted, timekeepers added extra days to realign the year. In this way, the Somali calendar remained both flexible and deeply practical, a scientific instrument without paper, written instead in memory and sky. And despite modern stereotypes, Somali were and are deeply versed in astronomy. Pastoral nomads did not need telescopes to map the heavens. Night after night, for countless generations, they read the movements of the dayax, the moon, and the hidigaha, stars, and they tracked constellations rising and falling, winds shifting, and the subtleties of light in the horizon. This was not just folk belief. It was advanced, empirical knowledge, refined through observations, as rigorous as any astronomer's logbook. Somali weather lore experts could tell you, by a single night sky, whether the year ahead would bring drought or abundance. They could forecast rain, predict animal health, and decide migrations across hundreds of kilometers with extraordinary precision. So when we speak of the Somali calendar, we are not speaking of something quaint or outdated. We are speaking of a living cosmology, as old as the desert winds, as precise as any modern system, and as poetic as the gabay. The Somali calendar exists in two forms: the lunar, dayax-tiriska, and the solar, amin-tiriska, which tracks the seasons. To understand it, imagine being a nomadic herder in the open plains of Somalia. There are no mechanical clocks, no printed calendars pinned on your wall, no digital weather apps. Your survival and that of your camels, sheep, and goats depend on knowing when the rain will arrive, when the grass will sprout, when the rivers will swell, and when they will dry. The sky becomes your greatest teacher. Each month begins not with a mathematical calculation on paper, but with the actual sighting of the new moon. The thin crescent, dayax-usub, marks the birth of a month. Unlike the Gregorian calendar, where months are fixed, 30 days, 31 days, with February made to behave by leap years, Somali months are alive. They breathe with the moon. They shift between 29 and 30 days depending on observation and not as fixed and advanced. These months were grouped into two kinds. Kun Dalat, the full-born, months of 30 days. Toman, the short months of 29 days. Together, they made 354 days, close to the lunar year known across the Islamic world. But the Somali system added its own refinements. When the months drifted too far from the solar seasons, weather experts would sometimes insert an extra day or two at the end of the month. This subtle adjustment kept the calendar in harmony with the agricultural year, something the strict lunar Islamic calendar does not do. This blend of solar and lunar timekeeping shows the scientific sophistication of Somali pastoralists. They understood that while the moon was vital for marking months, the sun governed the seasons, and both had to be balanced for survival. But the Somali calendar was not only technical. Each month carried meaning, symbolism, and omen. Sabuh, known as the month of camels, was watched with intensity. If it lasted 29 days, herders braced for hardships, disease, and poor grazing. If it stretched to 30, they celebrated, for it promised fertility and plenty. Wabiris, called the mother of astronomy, was another critical month. Should it close at 29 days, milk would be scarce in the year ahead. Should it end with 30, it foretold abundance. So time here was never neutral. It was alive, moral, and faithful. And then there was Dambasamo, a night in fall when rams were let loose among ewes for mating. This moment too was bound to prophecy. If rain fell that night, prosperity was certain. If skies stayed dry, scarcity was feared. In this way, even the mating of animals was timed with cosmic cycles. It is worth pausing here to appreciate what this tells us about Somali science. We are often taught that astronomy is a written science, measured in observatories, logged in almanacs, and coded in mathematics. But Somali astronomy was oral, embodied and pragmatic. Knowledge of stars, months, and omens was not stored in books, but in memory, song, and seasonal rituals. It was carried by weather lore experts, who were human calendars themselves. And yet, despite being unwritten, this system was remarkably accurate. It guided migrations across hundreds of kilometers, predicted the arrival of rains, and balanced lunar months with solar cycles, all without pen or paper. This makes the Somali calendar comparable to the great calendars of antiquity. The ancient Egyptians used the heliacal rising of the star Subdet, Sirius, to time the flooding of the Nile. The Mayans developed complex cycles tracking Venus. But Somalis, in their own tradition, used the living sky, moon, and stars to anchor their entire existence. And what makes it unique is that it was woven seamlessly into life. For the pastoralists, time was not abstract. It was not numbers on a page. It was the greening of grass after the first drops of rain, the fattening of camels in a prosperous year, the scarcity of milk in a failed month, the precise night when animals mate, or when people gather for poetry, prayer, or Dubshed, the New Year fire. In short, the Somali calendar was both science and story. It was precise enough to guide migrations, yet symbolic enough to shape belief. It was astronomy written in the heavens and poetry remembered in the heart. Now, let us explore the great turning point of the Somali year, Dubshed, the lightning of the fire. Imagine this. It is early August in the Somali countryside. The air is heavy, carrying the scent of dry earth waiting for rain. Families and clan gather together. In the heart of the settlement, a fire is lit. Flames crackle, sparks leap upward. Children laugh and run in circles around the blaze, and elders recite words of remembrance. This is Dubshed, the Somali New Year, one of the most important communal events in the Somali calendar. The celebration usually takes place on one of the first nights of August, most often the 4th. It is not a random date. August marked the transition into a new cycle of seasons, a threshold between scarcity and renewal. In Somali oral tradition, this night was called Norish, or Kalagur, meaning the turning of the year. The bonfire of Dubshed was not just symbolic play. Fire in Somali cosmology is both cleansing and renewing. Lighting a fire at the year's threshold burned away the residue of the past cycle and made space for blessing in the new one. Just as bushfire can clear old grass to allow new shoots, Dubshed was seen as clearing the spiritual and social grounds for fresh growth. The flames also functioned as a cosmic clock. By observing the fire, the night sky, and the surrounding weather on this particular evening, Somali weather lore experts made predictions for the entire year ahead. What made Dubshed truly remarkable was its role in timekeeping. It was not simply a cultural festival. It was also a night of astronomical and meteorological reckoning. Weather experts and elders would watch closely. If rain fell on Dubshed, it was a dire omen. It foretold war in the coming year. with the scale of conflict proportional to the heaviness of the rain. If the night was clear, with stars visible, this was an auspicious sign. It meant health, prosperity, and relative peace. If the wind rose strongly, it foretold balance in nature, a good omen for herders and farmers alike. In this way, Dubshed was both ritual and science, a moment when society paused, read the heavens, and entered a new cycle armed with foresight. There is another fascinating aspect to Dubshed, its rhythm within the Somali calendar. Every 3 years, the new year shifts by a month, marrying it in turn. So over 36 years, it was said that Dubshed would wed all 12 months of the Somali year. This poetic image shows the Somali understanding of time not as rigid but as relational, like a marriage, weaving together cycles of moon and sun, season and ritual. This kind of cyclical thinking has parallels in other traditions. The Babylonian, Mayans, and Chinese also track long cycles of 1952 or 60 years, where lunar and solar calendars realign. The Somali 36-year cycle shows similar sophistication, developed not in temples or courts, but in the open landscapes of the Horn of Africa. Beyond astronomy, Dubshed was also a powerful social ritual. It was a moment of unity. Clans that have been scattered across grazing lands would come together to mark the passage of time. Elders shared stories, youth performed poetry, and prayers were made for fertility of land, herds, and families. For Somali Sufis, fire was also a metaphor for the soul's purification. Just as flame consumed wood, the soul must burn away impurities to become light itself. In some dhikr gatherings, poetry would even describe the heart as a fire, ignited by divine love. In this way, Dubshed was not only about seasonal change, but also about inner transformation. It is striking to note that many cultures celebrate the new year with fire. From the bonfires of Celtic Samhain to the fireworks of the Chinese Lunar Year, fire marks transition. But the Somali Dubshed is unique, in that it ties directly into weather prophecy, lunar cycles, and pastoral survival. It is not just symbolic spectacle, it is practical science and spiritual wisdom intertwined. And though today it is less widely practiced, traces of Dubshed remain in Somali memory and oral poetry. It continues to stand as proof that Somalis had their own highly developed calendrical system, deeply rooted in the land and stars, long before colonial typekeeping imposed itself. In the flame of Dubshed, we see the Somali philosophy of time itself, cyclical, symbolic, alive, and always turning toward renewal. Nafsi, Naqsi, Nuro, Barakin, the forces of time. Somali thought did not separate time from morality. The passing of days, the arrival of rains, the rise and fall of leaders, these were not just accidents of weather or politics. They were woven into a greater moral order, where actions had consequences, not only for individuals, but for entire communities and landscapes. 4 key concepts express this vision: Nafsi, Naqsi, Nuro, and Barakin. Nafsi, retribution. Nafsi is the force of retribution. It is the idea that wrongdoing brings calamity, not only to the wrongdoer, but to the land and people connected to them. For nomads, Nafsi was most often linked to injustice, arrogance, or betrayal. If a leader mistreated his people, if wealth was hoarded instead of shared, if sacred traditions were broken, the result would not only be social unrest, but also natural disaster. Rains would fail, herds would weaken, and sickness would spread. Somali oral poetry contained warnings like Nafsi wa mel an al-mirin, retribution is a road not to be traveled. In history, many elders linked great tragedies, famines, wars, even the collapse of states to collective Nafsi. The fall of the Somali Republic in 1991, for example, is often remembered by elders not only as political failure but as moral failure. Leaders who abandoned fairness, clans who turned against each other in a society that lost its balance. Naqsi, decline. If Nafsi is sudden retribution, Naqsi is the slow erosion of abundance. It is decline, diminishment, the withering away of fertility and blessing. Pastoralists saw Naqsi when wells began to dry earlier each season, when herds produced less milk, when grasses did not grow as before. But it was also applied to human affairs. A clan that failed to maintain unity, or a leader who neglected wisdom, would suffer Naqsi, the gradual loss of prosperity. This concept reminds us that decline is often quiet. It doesn't arrive in a single catastrophe, but in the steady weakening of values, resources, and relationships. For modern Somalis, Naqsi can be seen in the erosion of trust between groups, in environmental degradation, in the slow disappearance of cultural knowledge, and when the most vulnerable in the population lose their rights. It is a call to vigilance, to recognize decline before it becomes collapse. Nuro, hidden nourishment. Again, these forces of decline stands Nuro, a mysterious life-giving energy believed to flow through the land. It is the subtle nourishment that makes grass grow after rain, that gives camels endurance across dry seasons, that blesses the womb with fertility. Nura is not only physical, it is spiritual light, an unseen current of vitality, a community in harmony, a family that lives with honesty, a leader that rules with justice. All attract Nura. In Somali Sufi traditions, Nura is often linked to the Quranic Nur, the divine light that illuminates creation. Just as the moon reflects the sun's light, the heart reflects divine Nura when it is polished by dhikr and humility. Elders say, a land without Nura is a land without soul. In drought years, Nura was believed to have retreated, a sign that society must return to fairness and remembrance. Barakin, the blessing. At the heart of Somali cosmology stands Barakin, blessing, fertility, abundance. It was not simply a practical idea of prosperity, but a sacred force, believed to flow through the land, through people, and especially through the lives of the righteous. In Somali tradition, Barakin was intimately tied to sacred places. Certain wells, trees, and landscapes were believed to carry baraaka. A green oasis in the middle of a desert was not only life-giving but also spiritually charged. Elders would tell children, this is a place of blessing. Do not enter without respect. Awliyas, saints, friends of God. Somalis, like many Muslim communities across Africa, held reverence for local saints, whose piety and wisdom radiated baraaka. The tombs of such figures, often marked by simple domes or shaded trees, became places of pilgrimage and prayer. Families would visit to seek intercession, fertility, or healing. And in Sufi traditions, dhikr circles, where communities gathered to chant the names of God, were believed to generate barakin, blessings that extended beyond the circle into the whole community. Weddings, rain prayers, and even harvest celebrations often incorporated Sufi poetry and remembrance of God, weaving baraaka into everyday life. It was widely believed that to sit in the company of the pious was to absorb some of their baraaka. To share food with a saint was to invite blessing into one's household. To marry within a family known for piety was to strengthen the flow of barakin across generations. But baraaka is fragile. It is not automatic. It can be lost. Elders often lament that Somalia's tragedies, famines, endless conflict, environmental collapse may be linked to the neglect of baraaka. In the 20th century, as colonial pressures, modern politics, and later extremist ideologies spread, many Somalis began to distance themselves from their Somali Sufi traditions. Sacred places, once visited with reverence, were abandoned or desecrated. The shrines of the awliya were sometimes destroyed, and their memory branded as innovation, bid'ah, or superstition. In doing so, some argue that Somali society severed itself from a spiritual ecology that had long sustained it. For centuries, reverence for saints and sacred places served as moral anchors, reminders of humility, community, and divine presence. When those anchors were discarded, the sense of baraaka seemed to fade. A Somali elder once put it bluntly, "Markan ka cararne awliyada, barakadini way naga cararte." When we fled from the saints, the blessing fled from us. In Sufi cosmology, baraaka is not just personal, it is cosmic. The awliyas are seen as channels through which divine blessing flows into the world. Some traditions even describe them as pillars holding up creation. To honor them is to remain connected to God's mercy. To neglect them is to risk dryness, not only of land, but of soul. Thus, abandoning these traditions may help explain why many Somalis today feel a sense of disconnection, restlessness, and decline. Without baraaka, even material gains, money, buildings, and institutions fail to yield true prosperity. In the Somali tradition, taken together, these four forces created a moral cosmology. Wrongdoing brings nafsi, retribution. Neglect brings naqsi, decline. Righteousness attracts nura, hidden nourishment. Harmony sustains baraaka, blessing. This system tied ethics directly to ecology. How people lived determined how time itself unfolded. A drought was never just weather. It was a mirror of moral imbalance. A fertile season was not just luck. It was baraaka, earned through justice, generosity, and prayer. So what do these concepts teach us Somalis today? First, that crises are not just technical. Famine relief and development aid are not enough if moral and communal bounds are broken. Without addressing injustice, corruption, or division, societies risk nafsi, or naqsi, even when resources are present. Second, that renewal requires nura, the hidden nourishment that comes through education, fairness, and spiritual grounding. Somalia's resilience through decades of hardship can itself be seen as evidence of Nura, a mysterious vitality that has not let the nation die. Third, that the path forward lies into cultivating baraaka, blessings, but blessings do not arrive by chance. They are built through unity, care for the land, and respect for ancestral wisdom. In the Somali worldview, time is not blind. It responds to how we live. The rain, the herds, the harvests, the stability of leaders, all are woven into a web of cause and consequence. Nafsi warns us of the cost of injustice. Naqsi warns us of the danger of neglect. Nuro reminds us of the hidden light that sustains life. And Baraka shows us the way back to blessing, fertility, and peace. If Somalis today wish to enter an era of renewal, they must remember these forces. For history teaches us that time itself bends towards justice, but only if we are willing to align with its deeper laws. So what can cycles in the Somali calendar teach us about our recent history? Somalis have never seen time as a straight road. Instead, it is a wheel, a circle that spins endlessly, where events repeat not in exact imitation, but in echo and rhythm. The weather lore experts, those elders who memorized sky and season, also spoke of cycles of years. These were not just only measurements of rainfall or harvest, they were also rhythms of history, of droughts and abundance, peace and war, flourishing and decline. At the smallest scale were the 3-year cycle, used to harmonize lunar months with the solar seasons. Every 3 years, adjustments were made so that months would realign with agricultural reality. This small cycle taught us a larger truth. Life requires constant correction. Just as time needed adjusting, so do human affairs. But the cycle most often spoken of was the 8-year cycle, Sidid Guru. It was seen as reliable, a rhythm of return. What happened in 1 year was believed to echo 8 years later. Drought, if it struck, would often strike again in the same pattern. Prosperity, too, would return after 8 years of hardship. Even today, elders say, if you want to know tomorrow, look at 8 years ago. Beyond these came the 30-year cycles, in which larger historical events seemed to ebb and flow. A war and famine or a political shift might resurface in altered form 3 decades later. Elders believed that while the cycle repeated, its intensity often weakened with time, like an echo fading in the desert air. Then there was the 50-year cycle, the Guruin, the Great Cycle. This was never taken lightly. To the Somali mind, it never failed. A devastating drought, the fall of a leader, or a shift in social order, seen 50 years ago, was expected to resurface again. And finally, the longest, the 80-year cycle, the lifespan of a human elder. It was said that in 80 years, history completed a full turn. What a grandfather witnessed in his youth, the grandson would see again in his lifetime. This was not superstition. It was an early philosophy or recurrence, a recognition that human history, like seasons, repeats itself in spirals. So let us pause and test these cycles against Somali history. In the 80s and 90s, Somali society faced massive upheaval. The rise of colonial rule, the resistance of Saeed Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, and cycles of famine and war. 50 years later, in the 1940s, Somalis again faced transformation. The collapse of Italian rule after World War II, British administration, and the stirring of nationalist movements. Another 50 years brings us to the 90s, the collapse of the Somali state, civil war, famine, and displacement. Here, the 50-year cycle seems to ring true, great ruptures every half-century. The 8-year rhythm can also be observed. Think of the devastating 2011 famine and the echoes of drought and near famine that returned in 2019, and again in 2022. This is a resonance of Sidid Guru. Even the 30-year cycle seems visible. Somalia gained independence in 1960. 30 years later, in 1990, the state collapsed. Another 30 years, 2020, finds Somalia once again at a crossroad, fragile but with possibilities of renewal. So where are Somalis in the cycle today? If we trace back the 50-year cycle, 1890s, colonial imposition. 1940, the start of the liberation movements. 1990, the collapse of the modern state. 2040s, another great turning point is expected. That means we are now in the in-between space, the preparatory decades before a major shift. These are the years of sowing seeds. What is planted now will define the Somalia of the 2040s. Now, if we look at the 30-year cycle, 1960 was the independence. 1990 was the collapse, and 2020 is the start of a fragile recovery. This suggests that the 2020s are a time of rebuilding and a chance to reverse decline and prepare for renewal. And if we think of the 8-year rhythm, then the crisis of the early 2010s and again of the early 2020s may soon give way to a cycle of gradual recovery as we approach the late 2020s. So what can Somalis learn from these cycles? First, that crisis is not permanent. Every drought, every collapse, every war is part of a larger spiral. History bends back toward renewal. Second, that preparation matters. Just as herders prepared for drought by storing milk and seeking new grazing, Somali society today must prepare by investing in education, rebuilding institutions, and caring for the land. And third, that unity is essential. The cycles show that division and injustice bring nupsi, calamity. Renewals requires baraaka, blessing, which comes through harmony, fairness, and shared purpose. In short, we are in an age of threshold, not yet renewal, not holy darkness, a time of testing and of possibility. The Somali vision of time as cyclical reminds us that despair is never final. As the moon waxes after waning, as the rain returns after drought, so too does history turn. The real question is not whether renewal will come, but how prepared we are to meet it. Thank you for joining me on this second episode of Somali Spirit. If this story touched you, share it, keep the conversation alive, and remember, every story told keeps our roots strong. Until next time, nabad ya hafimad, peace and health to you.